British historian Tudor Parfitt has had a career-long fascination with the Black Jews of Southern Africa and their claims to have brought an ark-like object with them into Africa centuries ago. He had examined textual, archaeological and medical evidence and was sure that their oral tradition about their association with the ark was not that far-fetched. In 2007, he got a call from Africa.
I was given a tip from a white South African. He said he'd found the Ngoma, and given that I'd been looking for a good time, I was interested, to say the least. And so I got on a plane and went to South Africa.
Magdal had summoned him after this source had made contact with her. When Parfitt arrived, they went on an expedition into the Soutpansberg Mountains to look for the ark.
Along with Professor LaRue, we went up into the Venda area to where this great Ngoma allegedly was.
When they arrived at the village, they discovered that over the years, many replicas of the original Ngoma have been fashioned, usually to represent the Ngoma in ceremonies or to help safeguard it or simply to confuse enemies. After getting permission from the elders of the village, they were shown a number of drums in a hut.
And unfortunately, it proved not to be anything of either any antiquity or any interest. So it was a wild goose chase.
Parfitt was disappointed because the drums they were shown were clearly fairly recent copies of the Ngoma. But Parfitt wouldn't give up. He again scrutinized his sources and recalled a book by Harold van Sickard, the missionary who, in the 1940s, studied the Lemba intensely. In his book, he claimed to have found the Ngoma in a cave in the Soutpansberg Mountains.
He had found the Ngoma by following oral traditions. He managed to follow it back to a particular cave in the Limpopo Valley, but apparently there was a skeleton lying next to the Ngoma, and local traditions seem to support the idea that this was a priest that had died, presumably the last guardian of the Ngoma. He photographed it.
Von Sickard writes that he took the Ngoma to the museum in Bulawayo, where he left it. Parfitt followed up, but nobody at the museum knew anything about such a drum or ark or Ngoma.
Nobody had the foggiest idea what I was talking about. And very, very kindly, they went through their stocks and into their storerooms and never came up with anything.
Then, by pure coincidence, Parfitt met a man who worked on the railways during the Rhodesian Civil War in the 1970s.
He just told me a bizarre story about when he'd been driving this train from Bulawayo to the capital, that on one occasion they'd taken a shipment of artifacts, ethnographic artifacts. And he remembered because his friend had stolen a mask. It was round about Christmas time. He stole the mask, gave it to his wife. And it just occurred to me that the Ngoma might have been in that shipment or in a similar shipment. This was during the Civil War. They were trying to take the valuable stuff and put it in a safe place.
So then, Parfitt scoured the museums in Harare and found that the Zimbabwe Museum of Human Sciences had a large collection of undocumented drums.
Very kindly, they opened up the part that the public is never allowed into, where they keep old stock, which is not ever exhibited. And we went in, and in the second alcove, on one side of the corridor, I saw what I thought was the Ngoma. It looked very similar. And some of the museum staff carried it out. And when I saw it in the light, I realized that this was it.
Then something bizarre happened.
And as I was looking at it and thinking about these things, I saw that there was a great pool of blood covering the floor underneath it. And then I thought it was the African guy that was carrying it. And indeed, it turned out to be that he'd cut his hand on the wood of the Ngoma, but in an incredibly deep and savage way, we had to take him to the hospital.
Parfit was convinced that he had found the fabled Ngoma Lungundu, the Ark of the Covenant. It was quite a moment for him.
In a way, the whole kind of episode turned into a sort of piece of magic realism, because on the one hand, I'm a complete rationalist, but on the other hand, I knew that this object, over time, had all kinds of magical powers, or had been thought to have such powers.
His discovery made world headlines. Several documentary films were produced by the BBC and the Discovery Channel, and Parfit published a book about his find. It was followed by an exhibition of the Ngoma in Harare. It has become so revered by various groups that it has spawned new religious movements all over southern Africa.
So then a new chapter opens at that point in the history of the Ngoma, where new religions are formed, where important political figures start playing a role, including the president of a state. It has become an object of massive importance within Zimbabwe, for good reasons and for bad.
The Ngoma Parfit discovered in the museum in Harare has unfortunately become a complex issue with many claims to it.
It's venerated by too many people, different people, and everybody wants it for themselves. So the Lemba want it, and the Venda want it, and various other tribes within the context of Zimbabwe want it for themselves, and the government wants it for itself, and Mugabe wants it for himself. The museum wants it, and so on. So it's all very complicated, and one obviously is very afraid that some harm will come to the Ngoma, and clearly it should be in a museum.
But the euphoria of finding the Ngoma was short-lived. There were two major setbacks. First, Parfit discovered that the Ngoma was not as old as he had thought. He had it carbon dated.
Obviously, we were very interested to see how old this object was, and we had it carbon dated in the Department of Archaeology at Oxford University, and they came up with a date plus or minus 1300. Now, that's not as old as the Ark of the Covenant, but it's pretty damned old, and indeed, as far as I know, it's the oldest wooden object in sub-Saharan Africa.
If this was a 13th century object, it was perhaps a replica of a much older original, as it was customary among the Lemba and Venda to make replicas of the Ngoma to protect it and to confuse enemies. However, with this object, Parfit still believed he had come closer to the fabled Ark of the Covenant than any other before him. The second setback was that the newly found Ngoma vanished again.
Certainly on the street, the word has it that Mr. Mugabe is keeping the object, the Ark, the Ngoma, in his country property. And he's a very superstitious man. He's using it to keep himself in power, to keep himself alive. That's what people say. And it was first taken away from the museum by soldiers, armed soldiers, who came there at 3 o'clock in the morning. And since then, nobody has seen it as far as I'm aware.
So the object Parfit found was indeed very old, but it was definitely not ancient and not dating back to ancient Israel. Nevertheless, Parfit was satisfied that he had come as close to the lost Ark of the Covenant as humanly possible, and that his quest has been satisfied. But there still might be a twist in the tale. New claims have now emerged that a much older ark, perhaps one dating to the time of Solomon, has been discovered in South Africa. The claim of British researcher Tudor Parfit that he has traced the lost Ark of the Covenant, which the Lemba brought into Africa, has attracted world attention. Members of the Lemba, including Judge Joe Rawlinga, believe that Parfit had been on the right track.
I think Parfit's research has led us to discovering the Ark, and we're really very, very proud of the work that he has done.
Tudor Parfitt had fulfilled the promise he had made to the Lemba many years ago and had indeed managed to trace a 13th century copy of the Ngoma to Harare. However, archaeologist Richard Wade now claims that he has found a much older artifact, perhaps dating back millennia, in a cave in the Soutpansberg Mountains, protected by special guardians. He got a clue to the existence of this in a 1950s article published by Peter van Heerden. He wrote that he was taken by this man, Ntangeni Nechindulu, to a cave which is the gravesite of the legendary Venda leader Dabanika. In a cave nearby, Van Heerden was shown the original Ngoma Lungundu. In the cave, there were also two more recently made replica drums. This is a photograph of the replicas he was shown. Richard managed to trace Van Heerden, and through him, he found the grandson of the Guardian. The article by Van Heerden was first published in Afrikaans and didn't attract much attention. However, Richard took Van Heerden's article seriously.
That thing does exist, and I later, by accident, found the actual place. Hidden away in this particular place is the most sacred object in South Africa. I became revered by the people who guard those places, and they requested that I please reveal this.
That was when Richard gave Magda a call, and she got Parfitt to come to South Africa to find the Ark. Richard says when he, Magda and Parfitt went to look for this Ngoma, they indeed went to the right spot. However, the Guardians were wary of Parfitt, so they showed him much younger drums to stop him from investigating further. Parfitt was indeed disappointed and called the trip a wild goose chase. He then went on and discovered the 13th century Ngoma in Harare. Shortly after Parfitt abandoned the search, Richard returned to the gravekeeper's village and said he was taken up into this mountain by the gravekeeper. He claims that this cave is the final resting place of the legendary Venda leader Dambanyika, and that the lost Ark, the real Ngoma, is in this cave. It's in an area sacred to the Venda people.
In order to go to this zone, I need to first always ask permission from the king of the Venda people, who are, in a way, descendants of those original communities. And they are the progenitors of the Venda people, yes.
Richard received permission and was taken up the mountain to this cave by the current gravekeeper.
Several gravekeepers have gone through guarding this object, and there are other relics in this cave, apart from the leopards and the sacred leopard that lives there with its little kittens, which I discovered. It is a very, very sacred zone. The gravekeeper himself may not look at the cave and scrapes his face on the rocks and bleeds as he scrapes his way 50 to 100 meters coming close to the cave. So I was given a tremendous honor and privilege.
Apparently, the guardians of the Ark continued the practice of making replicas of the original and usually placed them in or near the cave. This is what Peter van Heerden photographed in the 50s, and the older 13th century copy eventually made its way to the museum in Harare.
And it would appear that this particular drum that Van Sickart took was inside the cave. However, there are the remains of the original Ngoma Lungundu in the cave, and you can see them. And above them are two new drums which were produced much later than the time when the drum was placed in the cave. So when those drums are broken, the gravekeeper will make new ones.
So, according to Richard, the original Ngoma, perhaps even the lost Ark of the Covenant, is still in that very same cave in the mountains. It's never been removed. Richard says he has seen the remains of this original Ark.
The drum that lies in the cave, to my knowledge, the one that is destroyed underneath the present drums, that is possibly a piece of the original. and it doesn't quite look like a drum.
So what does it look like?
More rectangular. But I can't tell you too much.
Again, Richard was pressurized to reveal more, and he was adamant that he had seen the Ark.
The actual Ngoma Lungundu is seemingly the closest contender at this point in time to the Ark mythology. And yes, it does exist in a cave, and it's real, and it is very revered, and it is very sacred. So I have seen it, yes, in its present state. And I have seen the new ones. And you can see it too.
Richard promised that he would reveal a photograph that he had taken of this object, but so far he has not complied with the request. But how feasible is it that a wooden object would even last nearly 2,500 years?
One might ask how long wood could survive. Now, we know that in Egypt there are boats, or the remains of boats, that are about 5,000 years old. So it's perfectly possible for wood to survive for very, very long periods. In the case of the acacia tree, and it is from that the ark was made according to the biblical account, it's an incredibly hard wood, and in the right circumstances, it could survive forever.
So it is possible for a wooden object to survive thousands of years. Richard is adamant that the object he saw in the cave is ancient and that it could be the original Ngoma. Has Richard Wade perhaps discovered the lost Ark of the Covenant? The fabled Ark of the Covenant was last mentioned in the Bible in conjunction with the reign of King Solomon 2,500 years ago. Then it vanished from history. Over the centuries, many legends and stories about its whereabouts arose. Some traditions say that the Ark was taken to Arabia, Egypt, or Ethiopia. Others connect this to a southern African tribe called the Lemba.
Essentially, the story is this, the Lemba story is this. We brought this object from the north, from Arabia, from Senna, and we brought it to Africa. The people who brought it were connected with the clan of the Buba. The clan of the Buba have got the same ancestor as Jewish priests. So it really did look as if there was some plausible connection with the Old Testament story. It wasn't simply a question of this ignorant black tribe having absorbed stories that were fed them by the missionaries. It looked like it was something very much more authentic.
The traditions further say the Lemba brought the Ark with them to southern Africa, but at some stage lost custody of it to another group closely related to the vendor. This group became its custodians and still has it hidden in a cave somewhere in the Soutpansberg Mountains. Some researchers like Tudor Parfitt believe that in the 1940s, the oldest remaining copy of it was found in the cave by a white missionary and taken to Zimbabwe, where Parfitt eventually discovered it. Richard Wade believes that since it was only a replica, the real Ngoma Lungundu, the real Ark of the Covenant, is still in a cave in South Africa.
So there is a possibility, when you come here to the middle of Africa and you suddenly find the DNA that belongs somewhere else, say in the middle of the Middle East, you've got to really start listening to their stories. And if their stories say, yes, we've brought with us some remarkable object and we can prove it, then you should take note. Yes, so archaeology, astronomy, and interdisciplinary studies, a little DNA and so on, you eventually find, yes, this is not something that is just totally a miss of the truth. Whether it is the Ark of the Covenant or not is, of course, the question. It is, I believe, part of the mythology of the Ark of the Covenant. And one needs to really physically go and have a proper look.
However, Richard is very reluctant to reveal the exact location of the cave and to bring this legendary object to light. He says it would be to the detriment of the local community.
Archaeologically speaking, people will become fortune hunters. You will have problems. It is a very sacred zone. And it is protected by a lot of people. But it will not be very nice if many helicopters and airplanes start infiltrating the airspace for a start. You know, just to open this sacred object because it's interesting, it might revitalize a certain community. But I think that community should rather be the protectors of this great treasure, and one should revere, to a certain extent, identify and publish, but not encroach and destroy.
Furthermore, Richard says that in addition to the Ngoma in the cave, there's also a lost city in that area that must also be protected. It's even vaguely visible on Google Earth images.
There is a city there which seems to precede Great Zimbabwe and may be as big as 3 kilometers in extent and walling. It is a remarkable building. The walls are very, very thick. They are 2 meters wide, and some of them are very high, up to, not as high as Great Zimbabwe, 10 meters, but up to 4 or 5 meters, I think, was the highest. Well, I couldn't get to see the rest. It's under tremendous vegetation, and so it's difficult to get there. But it is a sacred zone. And I think, it should stay sacred. It was rather a sad thing when Mapungubwe became revealed. Everything was destroyed for science.
Whether or not Richard Wade is correct in refusing to reveal the exact location of where he believes a very ancient object, perhaps even the Ark of the Covenant, is located, only time will tell. But what is certain is that the Ark of the Covenant and the many myths and legends associated with it will continue to fascinate generations to come. The search for the lost Ark is not over yet.